We began yesterday discussing the various psulim of Kohanim and the requirement that the avodah be performed by a Kohen kosher, certainly not a zar. And we excluded an onein, a tful yom, a chusa kippurim, a chusa b'gadim, mishein arachutz yadayim v'raglayim, orel, tamim. We had discussions yesterday about someone who worshipped avodah zarah, even b'shogeg, about a balmum, and we started a discussion about shisui yayin. That's where we're going to pick it up today. So we're on the bottom of page Chaf Tes, number Yidal. So this is number 11 out of 18 categories of psul kohen. We were wondering why there's tful yom and tameh as two separate categories. Okay, that's a kasha we'll address to the editor of Mesivta. In any event, shisui yayin, we said, is dafka revius yayin. And even if he doesn't get drunk, he's not intoxicated, he's got all his marbles about him, he's puzzled, b'toras shisui yayin, he could have drunk some other intoxicating beverages, and it's not miyusha b'daito, so then he should avoid doing the avodah, but shar mashkin ha-meshakrim, even if nishtabsha daito, although he's possibly avodah because he has to have his wits about him and he's intoxicated, but nevertheless, if he did the avodah, then he would not be chayav misa b'dei shamayim under the law of shisui yayin because he didn't drink yayin. Not only that, moreover, his avodah is kshera, assuming he did it kedasu kedid. So lachatchili he should not do the avodah. That's for sure, he's possibly avodah, but im avad, eino chayav misa v'avodasa kshera. And here he tells you to look in the Rambam Hilchos Bias Mikdash Perek Aleph Halacha Beis. Now this halacha has tremendous ramifications in the laws of tefillah. Tefillah is always a replacement for korban. And what would be if someone had drunk a revius yayin? Is his tefillah acceptable? Or alternatively, if he drank shar mashkin ha-meshakrim, would his tefillah be meaningful? And of course, it has repercussions as far as the laws of Nesias Kapayim are concerned. The Kohen who does the avodah after he drank a revius yayin, he does the Nesias Kapayim having drunk a revius yayin. And then there are all sorts of discussions about what is yayin, whether our yayin is the same as their yayin, what is the ratio between yayin and mayim, because we're not going to drink concentrated yayin, but rather diluted yayin, but what's the ratio between the mayim and the yayin, etc., etc. So all this is a sugya that halachically is rooted in the laws of avodas hamikdash, of the Kohanim, but has repercussions in other areas. Could be, by the way, that will have certain chumras in tefillah that would not apply to Kriyat Shema or brachos. So you have to know, it's very lamdish sugya whether or not the categories of shisui yayin are identical in A, tefillah, B, Kriyat Shema, and C, brachos. In tefillah, there may be halacha of omeid lifnei hamelech. And therefore, if he drinks shar mashkin, and he's not capable of carrying on an intelligent dialogue with the king because his mind is confused, then that might be a psul in tefillah because he's omed lifnei hamelech, but doesn't necessarily apply to Kriyat Shema or brachos. Now we go on to begadim. Until now, we spoke about mechusar begadim, and if you recall, we went through the 8 big day kahuna of a Kohen Gadol, the 4 begadim of a Kohen Hedgel, and if the Kohen is missing one of his begadim, he's completely excluded from avodah like a zar, because bigdeim aleim kedushasam aleim. And now we're going to talk about yitur begadim, where he wears an extra beged. Kohen Hedjot, who wears Chamisha Begodim. Let's say he stole, so to speak, one of the Kohanim Gedolim's Begodim. And we're talking about the 4 Begodim that go beyond the big day Hedjot. And he puts on, let's say, the ephod or the me'il of the Kohen Gadol. Oh, Shalovash big day Kohen Gadol. Let's say he wore all 8 Begodim of a Kohen Gadol. And now we have miyutar begodim in the case of the Kohen Gadol. Instead of wearing 8 begodim, he wore 9 begodim. Now you're wondering, what's that 9th beged? Well, if it's big day kahuna, that means he's wearing 2 hats, or he's wearing 2 tunics, the ksones. But what happens if he's wearing a suit jacket? Afilu hosif big beged chol. So he's wearing now 8 big day kahuna plus 1 raincoat that he bought in the local, coat shop. Number 1, he's possibly avoda because of the extra beged. Number 2, in avad, ila less avoda. His avoda is completely invalid. And number 3, he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. Number 4, he gets malchus. Ala guta zach. The whole gamut from soup to nuts applies here in Yitur Begodim. And basically, we can summarize it by saying that Yitur Begodim has the same status as Mechusar Begodim. He's considered like a zar. He's not, you might say, well, Yesh B'Klal Masayim Mana, he's not okay by adding a beggar, but he is wearing all the big day kahuna that he needs. No. It's an all or nothing enterprise. We're going to look at the entire michlol, the composition of all the begodim he's wearing, and he's got an extra begodim, and therefore he's not wearing big day kahuna. And in that sense, he has the status of a zar. Now, the language of Hareu Kizar in the case of Mechusar Begodim is explicit in the Rambam in Perik Yud Mehilchas Klei HaMikdash, because Klei HaMikdash is where you find all the dinim of Big Day Kahuna. And the 4th chapter there, he describes a Mechusar Begodim as a Zar, which means his avodas mechuleles, and he's chayav malchus, and misa b'dei shamayim. And the Rambam, by applying these same standards and yardsticks to a miyutar begodim, would seem to be maintaining that Hareu Kizar applies even to miyutar begodim, even though he's wearing the big day kahuna. It would make sense logically, and we'll see as we go through the halachas, that if the miyutar beged is a chatzitza to the other begodim, like let's say, for example, he wears a beged chol underneath his ksones. Or let's say he puts on a sash, and then on top of the sash he wears an update, or he puts on a hat, and on top of the hat he wears a big box. That I understand, because then he's not really wearing big day kahuna, because the chatzitza will separate the big day kahuna from his body, and therefore it's not levisha. But if he wears a coat on top of his begodim, and that coat is bigdei chol, then we're talking about an entirely different halacha. We're not talking about chatzis. Now we move on to lam. Karua begadim. We're still on the begadim, but in this case, he's wearing the begadim, but they are ripped, or one of them is ripped. Now, what kind of kriya with an ayin would generate the psul of karua begadim? Is it the same identical kriya of the mitzvah of kriya when you go to the kosel, or it's archetypal kriya alames? So once again, we quote the Rambam in Bias Migdash. Bigdei kahuna shall you kruim kederech shekorim, again korim with an ayin, alames, Pasali avoda im avad chayav b'dei shamayim v'lokev avodaso sheira. Now here we have a monkey wrench into our entire structure. We've always assumed that if he's going to get malchus for not wearing his begadim and he has the status of a zar, and he's even chayav b'dei shamayim, then ipso facto his avodah is psula, it's mechuleles, because he's a zar. And that certainly is true in the cases of mechusa begadim and miyutar begadim, as we discussed, but not in the case of karua begadim. The avodah is kshera. This, despite the fact that he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. And we'll give him 39 lashes. And this is all codified by the Rambam in Hilchos Bias Migdash. And the Rambam adds another chiddush. We've been discussing karua begadim, and he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. What about a case of a kohen she'avad shebegadav mitush tashiv? O aruchim al midasan o ktsarim pachos mimidasan. We have now the following cases. His begadim are rubbed out, they're not ripped, or perhaps they're too long for his body or too short for his body. And here the Rambam tells us a big surprise, a big chiddush. This is worse than karua begadim. V'areizeh mechalas havodah. Again, this is the Rambam in the fourth parak Klei Migdash, which we have to really study the Iyun Gadol, because why is mitush or aruchim yesal midasa or ktsarim yesal pachos midasa? Why is that worse than karua? It seems that karua is still a beged, and as we said before, his avodah is kshera. But when something impacts on the entire beged, and it's all mitushtash, it's all rubbed out, so to speak, disintegrated, or it doesn't fit the Kohen's body, that's not called a levish at all. The good news is that if he's not doing the levish at all, then we understand the Rambam's equation to zar. And the bad news is that now avodaso psula, whereas in karua, we said that his avodah b'diavad is kshera because it still has a shaved beged to it. But if he's not doing a levisha at all, you can't talk about a shaved beged. So for Shimon who's a Kohen, these begadim fit very well because Shimon is 6'2". But for Berzon, if Berzon was a Kohen, which I could never be, and I'm only 5'7" in the best analysis, then it's not a levisha for me, it's a levisha for him. Let Shimon wear these long begadim, or vice versa if they're short begadim. So the paradox here is that you can have something that's a beged, even though it's karua, You can have something that's not karua at all, but it's not considered a levishna, and that's worse than a beggar that's karua. So in a case that there's no levishna, because it just doesn't fit his body, then the avoda is psula. In the case where he has a perfectly good fit garden, but it's karua, the avoda is kshera because it still has the same thing. We move on to parua rosh. Now, halacha requires that a kohen take a haircut at least within every 30-day period. If he did not cut his hair within 30 days, he's called a parua rosh. He's got wild hair, 30 days. But I remember during COVID, there were months where I didn't take a haircut. I'm not a Kohen, and I'm not doing the avodah. If a Kohen does the avodah, he's got to make sure that he cuts his hair every 30 days, within 30 days. Otherwise, he's possibly avodah. If he does the avodah as a parua rosh, he hasn't taken a haircut for 30 days, he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. What about his avodah? Normally, we say that if he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim for doing the avodah, then his avodah is mechuleles. But we've already seen an exception to that rule in the case of karua b'gad, where he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim, but his avodah is avodah kshera. What about parua rosh? And the halacha is just like in the case of karua b'gadim, where the avodah b'di'evet is kshera, so too in the case of parua rosh, b'di'evet the avodah is kshera. He's not machal his avodah. This, despite the fact that he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim.
Rabbi?
Yeah, Don, speak a little loud if you can.
Okay, so he has to have a haircut within 30 days of doing the avodah, right? Not that he has to have a haircut every 30 days.
Oh, you're right. If we're talking about psule kuhuna, that's not the same as talking about the obligations of a kohen. We're talking about the obligations of the kohen within the context of avodah. You know, there may be other obligations that are incumbent upon a kohen in terms of how he dresses and how he presents himself that have nothing to do with avodah. And there you could ask, well, what happens if a kohen decides to have long hair? Like, you know, when we were young, I don't know if you're old enough, Don, to remember this, they were the hippies. Remember the hippies?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you do remember. Maybe you're a little older than I thought. And they had long hair. You have all sorts of different chazarai with long hair, you know, Hare Krishna, I don't know, all these crazy haircuts. And maybe a kohen should avoid those, but that's a different question. We're talking about his avodah. And in order to be kosher for avodah, the kohen has to take a haircut at least once in 30 days.
Okay, thanks.
And it's interesting, the Rambam derives this definition of 30 days from a nazir, because the shortest period of time of a nazir who's enjoined from cutting his hair is 30 days. So there's a gidul pera on the part of a nazir, meaning the nazir is obligated to be parua rosh, and the opposite is true in the case of a kohen or oved. He's not allowed to be a parua rosh. So as the kohen is not allowed to, the nazir is not allowed to cut his hair within 30 days because he's a nazir 30 days and there's an isu tiglachas nazir. The kohen in the opposite way has to make sure to cut his hair within 30 days, not later than. However, if he has relatively long hair, he's parua rosh, 30 days he hasn't taken a haircut, b'di'evet, he did the avodah is ksher. He's not a zar. So you see clearly that there are two halachas here, and they should be separated one from the other. One is halacha of Isur avodah, and the other halacha is kashrus avodah. The Isur avodah, when he violates it, might engender a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim, but yet the avodah is kshera. And we've seen this now in a number of cases. In the case of Karua B'Gadim, and now we see it in the case of Parua Rosh. I'm wondering, did we see this in the case of an onen? Let me just view an onen. No, not onen. What am I thinking of? Oh, yeah. You remember we had a case where Beis Chanya, where they set up an alternative temple, and the Kohen worked in that temple to bring a sacrifice l'shem shamayim. Was that the case? Let me just review this. Right. So the Kohen is not allowed to do an avodah that's appropriate for the Beis Hamikdash outside the Beis Hamikdash, even in a temple like Beis Chanya that was dedicated for Shamayim, for the God of Israel. And if the Kohen did that avodah, then like the case of Avodah Zarah, he's possible. But if he did the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash subsequently, after he did the avodah in Beis Chanya, his avodah is ksher. He was enjoined from doing that. So again, as I said before, we have two independent issues. One issue is the violation of the Isser when he's possibly avodah, and another issue is whether b'di'evet, if he did the avodah and he was excluded from the avodah, whether the avodah is ksher. We have at least three precedents of cases where he's excluded from the avodah. He's not allowed to do the avodah. He'll be chayav misa b'dei shamayim if he does the avodah, but yet avodah ksher. Now, at this point, we want to discuss cases where the avodah is disqualified because of the Kohen's suras havodah. Until now, we were talking about the Kohen's status. He's an onen, or a zar who's not even a Kohen. He's a tvul yom, he's mechus begadim, he's miyuta begadim, he is chaser kiddush yadayim raglayim, he's tameh, he worshipped an idol, he's a balmum, he's wearing begadim that are inappropriate for him, or his hair is too long. But what about cases where he just didn't implement the avodah in the tzura, in the ofen, the way he should have done so? The halacha is, we derive this from a pasuk in Dvarim Yudches, Ki vo bachar Hashem elokech b'kol shvatecha la'amod l'sharetz. I have chosen you, the Kohanim, from all the shvatim of Israel. La'amod l'sharetz. L'sharetz means to do the avodah, and la'amod means amidah. And from this we derive the conclusion that ein avodah nases ela bi'amidah. I sit in a minyan here locally in Katamon next to a person who cannot stand at all. He's in a chair now. People come, they put tefillin on him. It's a whole to-do. And he's in a chair. A Kohen is not allowed to do the avodah in a chair. And we can plead the case of a handicap, but it's not going to help. He's possibly avodah. Now he went ahead and he did the avodah b'yeshiva. Here's the exact opposite. The avodah is psula, but he's not chayiv malchus. Meaning, he has all the qualifications of kahuna. There's nothing psul in what we call the gavra, in the category and the profile. He has no psul. If he has no psul, then he's not enjoined from doing the avodah. There's no lav over here. But his avodah was done improperly. In the Maisa avodah, the kiyum of avodas hakarban, he did it b'yeshiva, the avodah is psul. So until now, we've been discussing cases that are both a violation of the Isur and the punishment plus the desecration of his avodah, it's disqualified. We discussed cases where he violates the Isur, and he'll get the punishment, but the avodah is still valid. And now we're talking about the flip side. The avodah is invalid, but he has not violated the Isur. And that's called Yeshiva. All this is codified by the Rambam in Hilchos Bias Migdash. Now, there's a sugya in Zvachim, which he quotes here in the footnote, it's on your test, called Amida Minatzat, which means that he is actually standing, the Kohen, when he does the avodah, but he's leaning on someone else. Someone else is lifting him up. And that is a sugya in the Gemara. The Gemara goes back and forth about whether that's called and qualifies as Amida or not. There's a Rashi in Zvachim Chav Gimel Amid Beis, which is a radical departure from everything we said about Yosef. Rashi writes that the pasuk of Kivo Bachar Hashem Elokecha Lamod L'Shoris indicates that the Amida is a condition in Ubo Bachar, and it reflects on the status of the Kohen himself. The Kohen in the yeshiva is not Ubo Bachar. He does not have the status of a Kohen. And Rashi says, Harei hu kizar. He has the same status as a zar. Which means, obviously, that his avodah is psula, but moreover, that he's violating all the isurim with all the punishments that we discussed, malchus and chiv misa b'dei shamayim, because he is a zar. That's the radical departure of Rashi. We've been assuming, like the Rambam, he's not a zar. His avodah is psula because he didn't implement the avodah in the right way, but he doesn't violate the lavim that apply to a zar. We said that a zar who does the avodah is chayiv misim b'dei shamayim and gets malchus. Not so in the case of Yosef. Now, I'm going to skip for a moment Tes Zayin and go to Yud Zayin, because I think Yud Zayin should be compared to Tes Vav that we just did about Yosef, and Yud Zayin is small. The Torah requires that the avodah be done with the right hand. This Kohen did the avodah with his left hand. And once again, like the Rambam before that we discussed about Yosef, where the status of the Kohen is perfect, there are no deficiencies in the Kohen's kashrus, but rather the psul is in the implementation of the Ma'aseh Avodas HaKarban. The Karban is pasul because the Avodah Psula biyad small, but there's no malchus here. There's no violation of the law. That's why I wanted to attach small to the case of Yosef that fit like 2 drops of water according to the law. But let's go back to Tezayin Chatzitza. Now, until now, we discussed Chatzitza from the perspective of Bigdei Kahuna. Let's say he has a Beged Chol that separates his Bigdei Kahuna from his body. But now, we're going to talk about Chatzitza in the Ma'aseh Avodah. What does that mean, Chatzitza in the Ma'aseh Avodah? The Torah requires that the Kohen stand on the Azor, on the Ritzvas Azor. What if he stands on a pillow, for example, something that is chotzetz, that separates between his body and the Ritzvas Azor? Tzarech shelo yeh davar chotzetz beino levein haritzvah. Ovad shu omer al gabi kelim. He's standing. That's good news. But he's standing on vessels. Or al gabi behema. He stands on an animal. Or afilu al gabi raglei chaver, standing on the legs of his friend. Avodaso psula. Once again, the implementation was not proper. Like we said in the case of Yosef and in the case of Smol, so too in the case of Chatzitza. A davar chotzetz bein gufo lebein ritzvas azora pasels the avod. Now, there's no mention of whether or not he gets malchus. I'm going to assume ain't no lokeh, because again, there's nothing puzzle in the status of the Kohen. It's only a psul in the avodah. And now we get to number Yud Ches. What happens in a case where the Kohen picks up the Kli, the Mizrach, in order to be Makabel, the Dam, but he doesn't pick up the Kli with his hand directly, but rather he's wearing gloves. It's a Davar HaChotze, it's Bein Yado Lebein HaKli. Once again, we're going to apply the same yards. The Kohen himself is kosher. There's no psul in the gavra of the Kohen. His status is that of a kosher. But there's a psul now in the avoda. Because the avoda has to be done, we'll call it lekicha or nesina. Lekicha meaning taking the kli, nesina and putting the dam on the mizbeach. Tzarich shelo lo yehei davar hachotzet beino levein hakli. Elotei lekicha nesina bi'atzmo, meaning begufo shel Kohen. That's a sugya in Zvach Madaf Mem Zayin. Avad kisheyesh davar hachotzet bein yodo levein hakli avodaso psula. Once again, it's a psul in the avoda. There's a chatzitza between his hand and the kli, and as a result, the avoda is possible. It doesn't say anything about giving him lashes or chiyuv risa b'nei shamayim, because in this case there is no violation of the law. He just did it in the improper way, and that passes his avoda, but he hasn't violated the law. Once again, quoting the Rambam in the 5th parak of Hilchos Bias Mikdash. Okay, this is where we're going to stop for today.